There is something buried beneath Paris that most people have never heard of. Not the catacombs that tourists visit, not the sewers that engineers maintain. Something else entirely. Something that existed for over a century, carried millions of physical messages through underground tunnels, and then quietly disappeared from public awareness so completely that today, most people do not even know it existed. That gap between what happened and what is remembered is itself worth examining. The strange part is not that this network was built. Infrastructure gets built all the time. The strange part is not even that it eventually stopped being used by the public. Technologies come and go. The strange part is how completely and how quickly it disappeared from collective memory. A system that was once central to daily life in one of the world's most documented cities simply stopped being talked about. And when you start to examine why, the explanation you find is not entirely satisfying. In 1866, a communication network was constructed beneath the streets of Paris. It did not use wires or electrical signals. It used pressurized steel tubes installed below the city, through which cylindrical containers were pushed and pulled by steam-powered compressors. Physical messages, written on paper, placed inside those containers, and sent traveling through the underground at speeds that seemed remarkable for the era. The principle was simple. The scale it eventually reached was not. The first experimental line was short. It connected 2 points in the city as a test. Engineers watched. Officials observed. The containers moved. The messages arrived. It worked. And when something works, the natural response is to expand it. So they did. Slowly at first, then with increasing confidence, the network grew. More lines, more connections, more offices brought into the system, more people able to send and receive messages through the underground. By the time the network reached its full development in the 1930s, it stretched across 427 kilometers beneath Paris. 130 offices were connected to it. Messages could be dropped into dedicated mailboxes on street corners, handed to clerks at telegraph counters, or placed in special collection boxes mounted on the backs of trams moving through the city. A message posted at one end of Paris could reach its destination on the other side within 2 hours. For that period, that was genuinely fast. It was not instant in the way we understand communication today, but for a physical message to cross an entire major city within 2 hours, reliably, consistently, every day, that was a system people trusted and depended on. And then there's the number that is most difficult to absorb when you first encounter it. In 1945, the network handled 30 million messages in a single year. 30 million. That figure needs to be held for a moment. That is not the count for a decade. That is not an estimated total across the system's full history. That is 1 year. To put that in some context, that works out to roughly 82,000 messages moving through those underground tubes every single day. That is not a curiosity. That is not an experiment that outlived its purpose. That is functioning infrastructure. That is a system woven into the daily rhythm of a city. So when someone first hears about this network and then learns that almost no one knows about it today, the natural response is confusion. How does something that large disappear from awareness? Infrastructure of that scale leaves records. It leaves maps. It leaves maintenance logs and government documents and photographs and personal accounts from people who used it. The information exists. The question is why it stopped being part of what people casually know about the city. Ask someone under 40 in Paris about the pneumatic postal network, and most will have no idea what you are referring to. Some will think you are describing something from science fiction. Ask them about the special blue message forms that millions of Parisians once used to send notes through those underground tubes, and they will look at you with genuine uncertainty. Ask them whether the French government maintained a private version of this network for its own use, separate from the public system, and most will assume you are confusing different things or repeating something you misread somewhere. But this is where it becomes unclear, because all of that is documented. The maps of the network have been preserved. The government records describing the parallel system used exclusively by official institutions have been archived. The maintenance histories, the message volume statistics, the design specifications, the construction timelines, all of it was recorded with the thoroughness that large government infrastructure projects typically receive. The information did not disappear. The awareness of it did. And those are two very different things. That distinction matters. When knowledge of something disappears because the records were destroyed, that is one kind of story. When knowledge disappears while the records remain intact, accessible, and verifiable, that becomes a different kind of question. It raises the possibility that the forgetting was not accidental. It doesn't fully make sense that a system handling tens of millions of messages per year would simply fade from public consciousness through ordinary historical drift. Most large infrastructure projects remain part of a city's identity long after they stop operating. Old train stations become landmarks. Decommissioned bridges become historical sites. The infrastructure is remembered even when it is no longer used. This network is different. It is not celebrated. It is barely mentioned. At first, it seems normal to assume that old technologies simply get replaced and forgotten. That is a reasonable general pattern. People stop thinking about telegraph poles after telephone lines arrive. People stop talking about horse-drawn streetcars after electric trams appear. The old system fades because the new system works better and draws attention. That explanation fits in many cases. But there is a problem when you apply it here. The timeline does not fully match. The public network was shut down in 1984. The government's private version of the same network continued operating for 20 more years after that, and a portion of it, connecting the two most senior offices in the French government, appears to still be in use today. That is not the pattern of a technology that became obsolete and was replaced. That is something else, and what exactly it is remains an open question. Some believe the disappearance from public memory was simply a result of the network's gradual decline before its official closure. Usage had been dropping for years. The introduction of fax machines and electronic communication reduced demand. People shifted to newer methods before the formal shutdown, so by the time the system officially closed, it had already been fading from daily experience for a generation. Others disagree with that reading and point out that a system handling millions of messages per year does not disappear from cultural memory, simply because usage declined in its final decade. The scale of what it was at its peak was too significant to simply be forgotten through gradual disuse. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely, because if the network was truly forgotten through natural historical drift, you would expect to find at least some cultural residue. Old cities hold onto their infrastructure stories. London still knows about its Victorian underground. New York still discusses its original elevated railways. These systems are part of how cities understand their own history. But the Paris pneumatic network sits in a different category. Not quite remembered, not quite acknowledged, present in the archives, but absent from the casual conversation of the city it once served for more than a century. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult, because the question of forgetting is connected to another question that is harder to answer. Who benefits from a communication network being forgotten? Most infrastructure, when it is decommissioned, becomes a point of local pride or historical interest. The fact that this one did not follow that pattern is itself a piece of information. It does not point to a clear answer. It does not confirm any specific interpretation. But it does indicate that the story of this network is not as straightforward as the simple arc of a technology that was built, used, and eventually replaced. There is also the matter of what the network represented beyond its basic function. This was not just a system for moving messages. It was a system for moving information quickly and privately through a city in ways that other people could not easily observe or intercept. A message placed in a pneumatic tube traveled underground, out of sight, through channels that only the people operating the system could access. In an era before widespread electronic communication, before the kind of surveillance infrastructure we are familiar with today, a physical underground message network had properties that made it genuinely distinctive, properties that certain users would have found valuable for reasons that went beyond simple convenience. That observation raises questions that this investigation cannot currently answer with the available documentation. It does not confirm that those properties were the primary reason the network was built. It does not confirm that they explain why certain parts of it were maintained long after the public system was shut down. But it does suggest that the official explanation, which centers entirely on solving telegraph overcrowding, may not be the complete explanation. There may be more layers to why this network was built the way it was built, who it was really built for in the first place, and why the knowledge of it faded so thoroughly from public awareness, while the infrastructure itself, in certain forms, quietly continued. How does something that large simply disappear from memory? That question does not have a clean answer yet. And more importantly, who decided it should? That second question is the one that remains most open. Decisions about public knowledge, about what gets remembered and what gets allowed to fade, are rarely made in a single moment by a single person. They accumulate over time through many smaller decisions. What gets included in official histories? What gets left out of public education? What gets maintained as a point of civic pride? And what gets quietly archived in documents that are technically accessible but practically invisible? The pneumatic network of Paris followed that second path. Technically documented, practically forgotten. And the gap between those two states is where this investigation begins. The official explanation for this network begins with a very ordinary problem. Not a conspiracy, not a secret agenda, just a city growing faster than its communication systems could keep up with. That is where the story starts, at least according to the accepted version. And for a while, that version is easy to follow. It makes sense. It fits the pattern of how large infrastructure projects usually begin. A problem appears. A solution is proposed. The solution gets built. But when you follow that explanation carefully, all the way through its details and its timeline, something begins to feel slightly off. Not dramatically wrong, just slightly off. And that feeling is worth paying attention to. By the middle of the 19th century, Paris was changing rapidly. The city was expanding in population, in commerce, in political importance. More people meant more business. More business meant more communication. And more communication meant more pressure on the systems that were supposed to carry it. The electric telegraph had arrived as a revolutionary technology, promising to connect people instantly across distances that previously required days of travel. When it first appeared, it seemed like the final answer to the problem of distance. Information could now move faster than any horse or ship. The world had changed, but the telegraph came with a structural limitation that became clear only as adoption accelerated. The system depended on a network of stations. Messages had to be delivered to a station, transmitted electrically to another station, and then physically carried to the final recipient. In a small city with modest communication volume, that process worked reasonably well. In Paris, during a period of rapid industrial and commercial growth, it did not. The volume simply outpaced the infrastructure. The numbers that survive from this period make the problem concrete. In 1851, Paris had 17 telegraph stations serving the entire city. That figure alone suggests a system designed for limited, specialized use. By 1867, that number had grown to over 2,200 stations. That is not gradual growth. That is an explosion in demand over roughly 1.5 decades. The infrastructure expanded, but it could not expand fast enough. Each station was receiving more messages than it could process efficiently. The queues grew longer. The delays became routine. What happened next is the part that sounds almost impossible from a modern perspective. Messages that were supposed to travel at the speed of electricity were being loaded onto horse-drawn carriages and transported through the streets of Paris. The congestion in the city made those journeys slow. Sometimes a message would take hours to travel just a few kilometers. A system designed for instant communication had become, in practical terms, slower than a person walking at a brisk pace could have covered the same distance. That was the reality of Parisian communication in the 1860s. This raises an immediate question. Why did the solution chosen involve building an entirely new underground infrastructure rather than simply expanding the telegraph station network further or reorganizing the delivery system? The answer given is that underground tubes offered something street-level delivery could not: speed that was independent of surface conditions. A message traveling through a pressurized tube beneath the streets was not affected by traffic, weather, crowd gatherings, or any of the other variables that made surface delivery unreliable. The underground route was consistent. It did not slow down because a market was blocking the road or because a political demonstration had gathered near a key intersection. In theory, that logic is sound, but it doesn't fully make sense as the only explanation because building 27 kilometers of underground infrastructure is an enormous commitment of resources for a problem that, on its surface, looked like it could be addressed through simpler means. In 1866, Napoleon III ordered the construction of the first experimental pneumatic tube line beneath Paris. The technical specifications were precise. Steel tubes, 65 millimeters in diameter, were laid through tunnels connected to the existing sewer network. Steam-powered compressors were installed at key points to create the pressure differential needed to move containers through the tubes. The cylinders that carried the messages were designed to fit exactly within those tubes, moving smoothly through the underground channels at speeds that could reach 40 kilometers per hour. For the era, that was a genuinely impressive engineering achievement. The precision required to make that system work reliably was not trivial. The first line that was tested connected two specific points: the Grand Hotel and the Paris Stock Exchange, a distance of approximately 1 kilometer. The round trip, a container sent and returned, took 12 minutes to complete. That detail is recorded in the official documentation of the project. And when you read it, the system sounds almost elegant in its simplicity. Place a message in a container. The container travels underground. It arrives. Someone retrieves it. The process is clean, mechanical, and does not depend on human reliability during the transit itself. It worked. That much is not in dispute. But this is where it becomes unclear. The choice of those two specific locations for the first test is worth noting: the Grand Hotel and the Paris Stock Exchange. Not a hospital and a government ministry. Not a residential neighborhood and a post office. A hotel catering to wealthy visitors and the city's financial center. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely. Who were the primary users of a message system connecting those two specific points? What kind of communication traveled between a luxury hotel and a stock exchange? The official framing presents this as a neutral technical test, but the selection of endpoints suggests something about who the early intended users of this system actually were. After the test succeeded, the network grew. The timeline of that growth is documented. By 1872, the network had doubled in size from its original experimental line. By 1879, the Ministry of Posts and Telegraphs opened the system to public use. By 1934, the network had reached its maximum extent: 427 kilometers of underground tubes, connecting 130 offices across Paris. That is a significant expansion over roughly 7 decades. And at each stage of that expansion, decisions were made about which locations to connect and which to leave out. Those decisions are not always explained in the records that are easily accessible today. The expansion followed a pattern, but the reasoning behind that pattern is not entirely clear. The 1934 peak is itself an interesting moment to consider. By that point, the telephone had already become a widespread technology. Electrical communication had advanced considerably since the telegraph era of the 1860s. If the pneumatic network was built to solve a telegraph overflow problem, why was it still expanding in the 1930s, decades after new communication technologies had arrived? Some believe the answer is simply institutional momentum. Large infrastructure projects develop their own logic. Organizations build around them. Budgets get allocated. Staff get hired. The system continues because stopping it requires active decision-making and disruption that bureaucracies tend to avoid. Others disagree with that reading. They point out that 427 kilometers is not the result of institutional inertia. That is the result of continued, deliberate investment over many decades. At first, it seems normal to accept the explanation that the network was simply useful and therefore continued to grow. Useful systems get maintained and expanded. That is a reasonable pattern. But there's a problem when you look at what was happening alongside the public network during this same period. While the civilian system was being developed and expanded, a separate network was being maintained for exclusive government use. Not just a few dedicated lines. A parallel system with its own infrastructure, its own routing, connecting specific government institutions to each other without allowing any outside traffic to pass through those particular tubes. That parallel network existed from the very beginning of the system's history. It did not appear later as an addition. It was present at the start. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult. If the pneumatic network was fundamentally a solution to public communication overflow, why did it require a completely separate government-only layer from its earliest days? Governments do maintain secure communication systems. That is not unusual, but the framing of this network in most of the accessible historical accounts presents it primarily as a public infrastructure project that happened to have some government use. The reality, as the documents suggest, is closer to the opposite. It was a government infrastructure project that was eventually opened to public use. That difference in framing is not small. It changes the basic question being asked about why the system was built in the first place. However, the timeline does not fully match the official explanation when examined in sequence. The government network came first. The public access came later. The justification given centers on solving a public communication problem. But if the public problem was the primary motivation, the public access would logically have come first, or at least simultaneously. The sequence that actually occurred suggests a different priority. It suggests that the system was designed and valued for its government applications first, and that public use was added as a secondary function, perhaps to defray costs, perhaps for other reasons that the available records do not clearly state. The surface explanation is clean. A city had a communication problem. A technological solution was proposed and built. The solution worked and expanded over time. When newer technologies made it less necessary, it was eventually shut down. That story is easy to follow, and it is not entirely wrong. But it leaves out the parallel government network. It leaves out the question of who the first users were and why. It leaves out the gap between when the public system closed and when the government system finally stopped operating. And it leaves out the portion of the infrastructure that, according to current information, has not stopped operating at all. The official explanation accounts for part of what happened. The part it does not account for is where the questions begin to accumulate. And those questions do not have clean answers in the documents that are currently available for review. If the pneumatic network was simply a solution to telegraph overflow, the explanation holds together for a while. It is logical. It is clean. A city had too much communication traffic. A new underground system was built to handle the excess. The technology worked. The network expanded. People used it. That version of the story is easy to accept because it follows a familiar pattern. Problems get identified. Solutions get built. Infrastructure follows need. But when you begin looking at the specific details of how this network was actually constructed, who used it first, and what features were quietly built into it from the beginning, the clean explanation starts to develop visible cracks. Not large ones. Not dramatic ones, just small, persistent details that do not quite fit the story being told. The first detail is one that tends to get mentioned briefly in official histories and then moved past without much examination. The pneumatic network was not built for the public. That point deserves more attention than it usually receives. For the first 11 years of the network's existence, from 1866 to 1879, the system was used exclusively by government institutions, not by businesses trying to communicate with partners across the city, not by citizens sending personal messages, not by newspapers filing stories or merchants placing orders, by government institutions. The public, whose communication overflow had supposedly made the system necessary, did not have access to it for over a decade after it was built. Now, one could argue that this is not unusual. Governments do frequently test new technologies in controlled environments before opening them to wider use. A new infrastructure system needs to be tested for reliability, for capacity, for failure points. Running it through government channels first, where usage is more predictable and the consequences of failure are more manageable, is a reasonable approach. That explanation is available, and some historians do offer it. The testing period interpretation is not impossible, but it requires accepting that an 11-year period constitutes a testing phase. That is a long time to keep a system in trial mode before deciding it is ready for public use. The first official line of the network did not connect a post office to a commercial district. It did not link a hospital to a pharmacy or a market to a warehouse. It connected government ministries to each other. That was the inaugural use of the system. The very first route that was established, the one that defined what the network was for in its earliest form, was a direct communication channel between offices of government. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely, because the choice of what to connect first in any infrastructure project reveals something about what the builders considered the primary purpose to be. And here, the primary purpose, as demonstrated by the first connection made, was government-to-government communication. At first, it seems normal to assume that government priority simply reflected the practical reality of who was funding the project. Napoleon III government ordered the construction. Government money paid for it. Government oversight managed it. Of course, the first users would be government institutions. That logic is straightforward. But there's a problem when you follow it to its conclusion. If the system was funded and built to solve a public communication crisis, and if government priority during the testing phase was just a practical formality, then the transition to public use in 1879 should have represented a full handover. The government tests it, confirms it works, and then opens it to the public it was supposedly built to serve. That is the sequence the official explanation implies. That is not what happened. When the network was finally opened to civilian use in 1879, the government did not step back and allow the public system to operate independently. Instead, they quietly constructed a parallel network running alongside the public one, not a minor variation or a few reserved lines within the existing system. A separate network, dedicated infrastructure with its own routing, its own tubes in some cases, connecting specific government institutions directly to each other. The Senate, the National Assembly, the Journal Officiel, the official record of the French Republic. These locations were linked by channels through which no outside message could travel. Only internal government communication moved through those specific tubes. This is where it becomes unclear. The official explanation for the pneumatic network centers on solving a public problem. But the government, at the precise moment it opened the system to the public, chose to build a private lane within it that the public could not access. Those two decisions happened simultaneously. The public opening and the private separation occurred together. That timing suggests that the private network was not an afterthought. It was not added later when someone decided that security required it. It was constructed as a deliberate feature from the beginning of the public phase, which raises a question the overflow explanation does not answer. If the system was built for public communication, why was a permanently private government layer considered necessary from the very first day of public access? The parallel network had specific technical features that distinguished it from the civilian system. According to official records from the period, one of the explicitly stated advantages of those dedicated government lines was their ability to maintain communication if the streets above were blocked by civil disturbance. That phrase appears in the historical documentation. Civil disturbance, not natural disaster, not flooding or fire or structural collapse. Civil disturbance, the kind of disruption that happens when citizens are in conflict with the state. The government built a communication system that was specifically designed to keep functioning during moments of public unrest. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult, because civil disturbance preparedness is a very specific design requirement. It is not the kind of feature you add to a system built primarily for handling communication overflow. If the problem being solved was simply too many telegrams, the solution does not need to include riot-proof infrastructure. Riot-proof features suggest a different set of concerns. They suggest that whoever designed the parallel network was thinking not just about communication efficiency, but about maintaining the ability to communicate internally during moments when the population might be actively disrupting normal operations. That is a security consideration, a political one, and it was built into the system from the beginning. Some believe this is entirely reasonable government planning. Governments are expected to maintain continuity of function during civil emergencies. Building redundant communication channels that can operate independently of surface conditions is exactly the kind of preparedness that responsible governance requires. A network that keeps working when streets are blocked is simply good infrastructure design. Others disagree with that framing. They point out that describing a communication system as riot-proof in its official documentation reveals something about whose interests were being prioritized. Public infrastructure is generally described in terms of what it does for citizens. This feature was described in terms of what it does for the government when citizens become a problem. However, the timeline does not fully match the overflow explanation when these features are considered together. The stated reason for building the network was public communication saturation. The actual first use was exclusive government communication. The transition to public access was accompanied by the simultaneous construction of a private government layer, and that private layer was explicitly designed to function during civil unrest. Each of those facts can be individually explained. None of them is impossible to account for within the official story, but together, they describe a system whose design priorities were quite different from its stated purpose. A system designed primarily for secure government communication, with public access added as a secondary function, would look almost exactly like what was actually built. That detail sounds minor at first, but it accumulates weight when combined with other observations. The Journal Officiel, one of the three primary institutions connected to the dedicated government network, is not a security-sensitive location in the way that a military headquarters or an intelligence office might be. It is the official record of government proceedings, laws, decrees, official announcements. The value of connecting it to the Senate and the National Assembly through a private communication channel that operates independently of public infrastructure is not immediately obvious if the primary concern is simple communication efficiency. But if the concern is ensuring that official government records can be maintained and transmitted even during periods of civil disruption, the connection becomes more logical. The government wanted to ensure that its official record-keeping could continue regardless of what was happening in the streets above. The question that remains unanswered in the official documentation is a precise one. What kinds of communications were actually traveling through those dedicated government tubes during the decades they operated? The public network left traces. The blue message forms, the petits bleus, appear in court records, in personal correspondence, in historical accounts of daily life in Paris. They are physically documented objects that passed through the system and left evidence of their existence. The government network, by contrast, is documented at the level of infrastructure. The tubes existed, the connections were established, but the content of what traveled through those specific channels is not part of the accessible historical record in any detailed way. That absence is itself worth noting. Public communication leaves public traces. Private communication, by design, does not. There is also the matter of how the parallel network fits into the broader infrastructure of Paris during this period. The pneumatic tubes ran through the sewer system. The sewers of Paris were themselves an extraordinary piece of engineering, built out extensively under Napoleon III urban renovation program. Beneath the streets, there was already a vast network of tunnels. Adding communication infrastructure to that existing underground architecture was technically straightforward, but it also meant that the government's private communication network was embedded within a much larger system of underground channels that connected much of the city. The tubes did not exist in isolation. They were part of an interconnected underground environment that also included passages used for other purposes, both official and unofficial. But this is where it becomes unclear again, because the official explanation focuses entirely on the tubes themselves and what passed through them. It does not address how those tubes related to the broader underground infrastructure around them. It does not explain how access to the government network was controlled in an environment where the surrounding tunnels were not always fully secured. The technical specifications of the pneumatic system are well documented. The security arrangements around the physical access points to the government network are considerably less clear in the available records. What the documents do establish is this. A system described as a solution to public communication overflow was, from its very first day, something more layered than that description suggests. It had a public face and a private infrastructure operating alongside it simultaneously. The private infrastructure had features designed for political rather than logistical concerns, and the reasoning behind those features was documented in official records, but never became part of the public understanding of what the network was. Most people who used the civilian system, dropping their blue message forms into street mailboxes and waiting for delivery, had no reason to know that beneath the same streets, a separate network was running messages between the Senate and the official record of the Republic through channels designed to stay operational if they themselves took to those same streets in protest. Whether that arrangement was simply practical governance or something worth examining more carefully is a question the available records leave open. To understand why the details of this network matter, it helps to step back from the infrastructure itself and look at the broader environment in which it was being built, because the pneumatic tubes did not appear in a stable, peaceful city with predictable political conditions. They were constructed during one of the most turbulent periods in modern French history. And when you place the timeline of the network's construction alongside the timeline of what was happening above ground during the same years, the sequence raises questions that the official explanation does not directly address. The infrastructure and the political context existed simultaneously. Understanding one without the other leaves a significant gap in the picture. The 1860s in France were not a period of quiet governance. Napoleon III, who ordered the construction of the pneumatic network in 1866, was ruling under increasing pressure. His government faced challenges from multiple directions. Economically, politically, and in terms of public legitimacy, the regime was under strain. The urban renovation of Paris that had been underway for years, transforming the city's layout under the direction of Baron Haussmann, was itself a politically charged project. Wide boulevards replaced narrow medieval streets. Some historians have noted that those wide boulevards had a practical military advantage for the government. They were easier to control than the old winding lanes, where barricades could be constructed quickly and held by small groups. Whether that was a primary motivation or a secondary benefit is debated, but the connection between urban design and crowd control was not an abstract consideration during this period. The Franco-Prussian War, which began in 1870, added a different kind of pressure. France went to war with Prussia and lost decisively. Napoleon III himself was captured at the Battle of Sedan in September 1870. The government effectively collapsed. Paris was besieged by Prussian forces for months. Communication in and out of the city became extremely difficult. Pigeons were used to carry messages. Balloons were launched to pass information across the siege lines. The city was physically cut off from the rest of the country for an extended period. And during that siege, the underground infrastructure of Paris took on a different kind of significance. The tunnels, the sewers, the underground passages became spaces where certain kinds of movement and communication could continue even when surface routes were blocked or monitored. After the Prussian siege ended, a new crisis followed almost immediately. The Paris Commune emerged in March 1871. It was a radical government that took control of the city for approximately 2 months. The Commune had its own administrative structures, its own military forces, and its own approach to managing the city. The French national government, operating from Versailles, eventually moved to suppress it militarily. The fighting that followed, known as the Bloody Week, resulted in thousands of deaths. Estimates vary, but the number of people killed during the suppression of the Commune ranges from several thousand to over 10,000, depending on the source. The city experienced intense urban combat in its own streets. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely, because the pneumatic network was under construction during this exact period. The experimental line had already been established before the war. Work on the network continued through and after the siege and the Commune. Engineers were planning extensions, while the city around them was in the middle of a political and military crisis. And the government that eventually stabilized France after 1871 was the same government that accelerated the development of a communication network specifically designed, according to its own documentation, to function when surface streets were disrupted by civil disturbance. The timing of that feature and the events that immediately preceded it are difficult to separate cleanly. Some historians note this simply as practical planning. Governments that have recently experienced communication breakdowns during conflicts naturally build redundancy into their systems. A government that watched Paris get cut off during a siege and then saw urban combat in its streets would logically want to ensure that future crises did not leave it unable to communicate internally. Building an underground network that could maintain function regardless of surface conditions is exactly the kind of lesson-learned response that follows traumatic institutional experience. That reading is available, and it is not unreasonable. Preparedness after crisis is a legitimate explanation, but others disagree with that interpretation, or at least consider it incomplete. They point to a specific detail in the sequence. The separate government network was not built after the crisis as a direct response to the lessons of the siege and the Commune. The government communication layer was being developed alongside the public system from the beginning of the network's expansion phase. The planning for dedicated government lines was not a reactive measure. It was built into the original architecture of how the system would function. That distinction matters because it changes the relationship between the crisis and the design. A system designed before or during a crisis, rather than after it, reflects a different kind of anticipation. This doesn't fully make sense within the overflow explanation alone. If the primary problem being solved was public communication saturation, the design response would focus on capacity. More tubes, more stations, more delivery personnel. The riot-proof features of the government network are not capacity solutions. They are continuity solutions. They address a different problem entirely. They address what happens when the government needs to communicate internally in a situation where the general public is the source of disruption. Capacity solutions and continuity solutions serve different purposes. The fact that the network was designed with both from the beginning suggests that both purposes were present from the beginning. At first, it seems normal to assume that large infrastructure projects simply incorporate multiple objectives simultaneously. A road system serves commerce and also enables military movement. A water system serves public health and also enables fire suppression. It is not unusual for a single piece of infrastructure to carry multiple functions. The argument that the pneumatic network was simultaneously a public communication system and a government continuity tool is not inherently contradictory. Both can be true at once. But there's a problem when you examine which function was prioritized in the actual design decisions that were made. The civilian system came later. The government system came first. That is the documented sequence. The first lines served government institutions. Government access was established and tested before public access was introduced. When public access was introduced in 1879, the government layer did not merge with the public system. It was maintained separately, as a parallel infrastructure with its own dedicated routing. The sequence is government first, public second, with the government layer remaining distinct even after public opening. If the public problem was the driving motivation, that sequence is difficult to explain. Infrastructure built to solve a public problem typically moves toward the public as quickly as the technology allows, not 11 years later, while a private layer is established first. However, the timeline does not fully match the stated explanation when the political context is layered in. The 1860s and 1870s were a period when the French government was managing significant internal instability. It had fought a catastrophic war. It had violently suppressed an internal uprising. It was in the process of establishing a new Republican government whose legitimacy was not universally accepted. In that environment, internal government communication was not simply an administrative convenience. It was a political necessity. The ability to coordinate between the Senate, the National Assembly, and official record-keeping institutions through channels that operated independently of public infrastructure and could not be disrupted by civil unrest was a meaningful capability for a government navigating a genuinely unstable period. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult, because once you place the network's design features within that political context, the oversight explanation, the simple story of communication infrastructure solving an administrative problem, starts to feel like a partial account. Not necessarily wrong, but incomplete. The features that were built into the government network, the separate routing, the parallel infrastructure, the explicit riot-proof design, all of those make more sense as responses to political instability than as solutions to telegraph overcrowding. They describe a government that was thinking carefully about its own operational continuity in a period when that continuity could not be taken for granted. What makes this harder to resolve is that the French government of the post-1871 period had legitimate reasons to think about operational continuity. The experiences of the siege and the Commune were real. The concern that future instability might again disrupt surface-level communication was not paranoid. It was based on recent direct experience. So the question is not whether the government had reasons to build a secure internal communication network. It clearly did. The question is whether the public explanation for the pneumatic system, the telegraph overflow narrative, accurately describes what the system was primarily for, or whether that explanation was a convenient framing for something that served a different primary purpose. That question does not have a definitive answer in the currently available records. The documents that describe the technical specifications of the government network are accessible. The documents that record the internal discussions about why specific design choices were made are considerably harder to locate, if they exist in accessible form at all. What was said in the meetings where the parallel network was planned? What priorities were articulated? What concerns were being addressed? That layer of the historical record is not clearly visible in what has been published or widely examined. Its absence does not confirm anything, but it does mean that the gap between the official explanation and the design reality remains open. The detail that is perhaps most difficult to explain away is also the simplest one. The civilian system came later. The government system came first. That sequence, more than any specific technical feature or any particular design choice, raises the clearest question about what the network was actually built to accomplish. If the public communication crisis was the primary problem, the solution would have reached the public first. The fact that it did not, that over a decade passed between construction and public access, during which the system served exclusively governmental functions, suggests that the public crisis, while real, may not have been the primary motivation. What that primary motivation actually was, the available documentation suggests but does not fully state. And that gap between what is suggested and what is stated is where the question remains. By the early 1900s, the pneumatic network had moved well beyond its origins as a government experiment or an administrative tool. It had become something that ordinary Parisians interacted with as a routine part of daily life, not as a novelty, not as an occasional convenience, as a regular, dependable system that people built their communication habits around. That shift from government infrastructure to public utility is worth examining on its own. But it is what happened within that public phase, the specific events that touched the network during its most active civilian period, that begins to reveal something more complicated about what this system actually was and who was actually using it. The range of things people sent through the pneumatic network by the early 20th century reflects how thoroughly it had been absorbed into the fabric of the city. Personal correspondence traveled through those underground tubes. A note written in one neighborhood could reach a recipient across Paris within 2 hours, reliably enough that people planned around that timeline. Businesses used the system for commercial communication. Contracts, orders, confirmations, the kind of time-sensitive correspondence that kept commercial activity moving were regularly fed into the network. Journalists filed stories through it, moving copy from reporters in the field to editorial offices before deadlines closed. The system handled all of it. Different purposes, different senders, different content, all moving through the same underground infrastructure. The physical object at the center of all this was a small piece of paper, a specially designed blue form, produced for use with the pneumatic postal system, known in French as the Petit Bleu. The name translates simply as the Little Blue. It was not an elaborate document. It was a standardized form, practical in design, created specifically to fit the requirements of the tube system. You wrote your message on it. You addressed it. You placed it in the appropriate container, and that container entered the network. The simplicity of the object is part of what made the system work at scale. Millions of these blue forms circulated through Paris over the decades the network operated. They appeared in personal correspondence, in business records, in court documents, in the background of historical photographs showing post office interiors and street-level collection boxes. That detail sounds minor at first. A blue piece of paper designed for a postal system does not seem like a significant historical artifact on its own. But the Petit Bleu accumulated a kind of documentary weight over time simply because it was present in so many different contexts. When historians look back at this period of Parisian life, the blue forms appear as evidence of how the network intersected with daily existence at every level. They are physical proof that the system was not peripheral. It was central. And when a specific Petit Bleu appeared at the center of one of the most consequential legal and political scandals in French history, that centrality became something more than a matter of postal records. The Dreyfus Affair is one of those historical episodes that shaped an entire country's understanding of itself. It began in 1894 when Alfred Dreyfus, a Jewish officer in the French army, was accused of passing military secrets to Germany. He was court-martialed, convicted, publicly degraded, and sent to a prison on Devil's Island, a remote penal colony off the coast of South America. The case seemed closed. A traitor had been identified, tried, and punished. But the evidence against Dreyfus was far weaker than the conviction suggested, and over the following years, a small number of people began to examine that evidence more carefully. What they found did not support the conclusion that had been reached. But this is where it becomes unclear, because the case did not simply involve a flawed investigation or a wrongful conviction. It revealed that the French military establishment had actively suppressed evidence of Dreyfus's innocence and had continued pursuing him even when internal investigations pointed toward a different suspect. The affair became a national crisis, not just about one man's guilt or innocence, but about the reliability of French institutions, the presence of anti-Semitism within the military and government, and the relationship between official narratives and actual evidence. France was divided. Families argued. Intellectuals took public positions. The country was genuinely fractured by the question of whether its institutions could be trusted to tell the truth. The key piece of evidence that eventually began to unravel the official version of events was a document recovered from an unusual source. A French intelligence officer, operating within the counterintelligence section of the army, had been monitoring the communications of the German military attaché in Paris. As part of that surveillance, French agents were collecting and reassembling documents retrieved from the attaché's waste. What they found, torn into pieces and discarded, was a pneumatic tube message, a petit bleu, a small blue form that had traveled through the very underground network that Parisians were using every day to send personal notes and business correspondence. At first, it seems normal to find a communication document in a spy's wastebasket. Intelligence work involves monitoring communications. Documents get collected and analyzed. A discarded message being retrieved and examined is standard tradecraft. But there's a problem when you look at what this specific message revealed. The Petit Bleu was addressed to a French army officer named Ferdinand Walsin Esterhazy. Its content indicated that Esterhazy had a relationship with the German military attaché that was inconsistent with his position as a French officer. It pointed, in short, toward Esterhazy, rather than Dreyfus, as the actual source of the leaked military information. This raises questions that go beyond the Dreyfus case itself. The pneumatic network was a civilian postal system, technically open to anyone who chose to use it. A message sent through the network was physically secure in the sense that it traveled underground through a closed system. But the network had offices and collection points and delivery personnel. The message had to enter the system somewhere and exit it somewhere. And intelligence agents, monitoring a foreign diplomat's correspondence, were in a position to intercept or at least recover communications that passed through or were associated with that monitoring operation. The fact that a communication through the civilian network ended up in the files of a French intelligence operation raises questions about how the network was being monitored, by whom, and with what authority. However, the timeline does not fully match the simple picture of a public postal system operating independently of intelligence interests. The pneumatic network had always had a government layer running alongside its civilian function. The parallel government infrastructure, the dedicated lines connecting official institutions, had been present since the beginning of the public phase. What the Dreyfus affair reveals, somewhat indirectly, is that the boundary between the civilian network and the intelligence apparatus was not as clean as the public framing of the system suggested. Communications traveling through a civilian postal system could end up as evidence in a military espionage investigation. That is not impossible. It is, in fact, understandable given the circumstances. But it indicates something about how the network was understood by those who operated within the French security and intelligence structure. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult, because the Petit Bleu at the center of the Dreyfus case was not just any message. It was a piece of evidence that, when properly understood, pointed away from the man who had already been convicted and toward someone else entirely. The French military establishment, when confronted with this evidence, did not immediately reopen the Dreyfus case. It suppressed the finding. The intelligence officer who identified the significance of the Petit Bleu, Georges Piquart, was transferred out of his position and eventually imprisoned. The evidence was buried for years before it finally became public. A message that had traveled through an underground civilian postal network had become the pivot point of a national political crisis, and the official response to that evidence was to hide it. Some believe the connection between the pneumatic network and the Dreyfus affair is essentially coincidental. The Petit Bleu was simply the format that happened to be used for that particular communication. It could have been a telegram or a letter. The fact that it was a pneumatic tube message is not, in this reading, significant in itself. What matters is the content of the message and the political response to it. The delivery mechanism is incidental. Others disagree with that framing. They point out that the specific properties of the pneumatic network, its speed, its physical routing through underground channels, its association with both civilian and government communication, may have made it a preferred channel for exactly the kind of sensitive communication that Esterhazy was conducting. A message sent through a busy civilian postal system, moving through underground tubes among millions of other messages, might have seemed less visible than a telegram sent through a more traceable channel. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely. The choice of communication method in intelligence and espionage contexts is rarely accidental. People conducting sensitive communications think about which channels are monitored and which are not. They think about what records are kept and where. The pneumatic network, as a physical system processing millions of messages per year, generated a very different kind of paper trail than electronic communication. A message was written, placed in a container, sent through a tube, delivered, and received. The record of that transaction existed at the office level, not at the level of the message content itself. For someone trying to communicate in a way that left minimal traceable evidence, a system processing tens of thousands of messages per day offered a certain kind of cover through volume. Whether that calculation was part of why the pneumatic network appeared at the center of the Dreyfus affair is not established by the available evidence. It remains a question rather than a conclusion, but the affair itself did something to the public understanding of the network that is worth noting. Before the Dreyfus case, the pneumatic postal system was simply infrastructure, useful, reliable, part of the background of city life. After the affair, at least for those paying close attention, there was a different awareness of what the network carried and who might be watching. A civilian postal system had become, briefly and visibly, part of the architecture of a national security scandal. And that connection, however indirect, is where the explanation of the pneumatic network as simple public infrastructure starts to weaken. The blue forms continued to circulate after the Dreyfus affair concluded. Millions more passed through the system in the following decades. The network kept growing. People kept using it for love letters and business orders and journalistic copy. The daily rhythm of the civilian system continued without obvious disruption. But the affair had revealed something that the official framing of the network did not acknowledge. The system existed within a larger context of surveillance, intelligence, and government interest that was not visible in the ordinary experience of dropping a blue form into a street mailbox. What traveled through those underground tubes was not only what the public understood itself to be sending, and who was paying attention to those communications was not something the official explanation of the network had ever clearly addressed. On March 30th, 1984, the public pneumatic postal network of Paris was officially closed. The date is recorded in administrative histories of the French Postal Service. The closure was not sudden or unexpected. It had been discussed for years before it happened. Usage had been declining. Costs had been rising. The network required ongoing maintenance of aging infrastructure spread across hundreds of kilometers beneath the city. The arguments for closing it had been accumulating for some time before the final decision was made and announced. When the closure came, it was presented as the logical conclusion of a process that had been underway for a while, a technology reaching the end of its useful life, a system being retired in the ordinary course of institutional decision-making. The explanation offered for the closure was straightforward. The pneumatic network had become obsolete. Electronic communication had advanced to the point where physical message tubes could no longer compete on practical grounds. Fax machines had made it possible to transmit documents instantly across the city without any physical movement of paper. Telex systems connected businesses and institutions through electronic networks that were faster, cheaper, and easier to maintain than underground tube infrastructure. The world had moved on. The technology that had seemed remarkable in 1866 was simply no longer necessary in an era of electronic communication. The closure in this framing was not a difficult decision. It was an obvious one. Most people accepted this explanation without much examination, and on its surface, it is reasonable. Technology does become obsolete. Systems do get replaced by better alternatives. The history of infrastructure is full of examples of networks that were once essential and then were superseded by something more efficient. Horse-drawn tram lines gave way to electric ones. Gas street lighting gave way to electric lighting. Early telephone exchanges gave way to direct dial systems. The pattern of old infrastructure being retired when better options arrive is entirely normal. Applying that pattern to a pneumatic tube network built in the 1860s seems straightforward. Of course, it was eventually replaced. The only question in this reading is why it took as long as it did. At first, it seems normal to accept the 1984 closure as the natural end of a long technological cycle. The network had lasted over a century. That is a genuinely impressive operational lifespan for any infrastructure system. When it finally closed, it had already outlasted most comparable technologies by decades. Accepting the obsolescence explanation requires no unusual assumptions. It fits the standard pattern of technological replacement that plays out across every sector of modern life. The tubes were old. The maintenance was expensive. Better alternatives existed. The system was closed. That sequence is clean and easy to follow. But there is a problem, a significant one, and it is not hidden in obscure records or difficult to locate in the historical documentation. It is simply a matter of what happened after the public closure in 1984. Because the French government did not close its own network when it closed the public one, the dedicated lines connecting the Senate and the National Assembly to the Journal Officiel, the official record of the French Republic, remained operational, not for a short transition period while alternative arrangements were established, not for a year or two while contracts were concluded and systems were decommissioned, for 20 more years, until 2004. 2 full decades after the public network was declared obsolete, the French government was still sending physical messages through underground pneumatic tubes beneath Paris. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely, because the obsolescence argument that justified the 1984 public closure did not apply selectively. If fax machines and telex had made physical message tubes unnecessary, that was true for everyone. The technology did not become obsolete for the public while remaining perfectly functional for the government. Physics does not work that way. The tubes were either a viable communication method or they were not. The compressors and cylinders operated on the same principles regardless of who was using them. The claim that the technology was obsolete in 1984 and the fact that the government continued using it until 2004 are not easy to reconcile within a single coherent explanation. This is where it becomes unclear. When questions were raised about the government's continued use of the network after the public closure, an explanation was eventually offered. The physical tubes, it was said, provided a communication channel with specific security properties that electronic systems did not share. A message traveling through a pneumatic tube beneath the streets of Paris could not be intercepted remotely. It could not be hacked. It could not be accessed by anyone who did not have physical presence in the specific section of underground infrastructure through which the message was traveling. In an era when electronic communication was increasingly subject to interception, monitoring, and technical compromise, a physical tube offered something that no electronic alternative could replicate: security through physical isolation. That explanation is coherent on its own terms. Physical communication systems do have security properties that electronic systems lack. A document traveling through a sealed underground tube is not accessible to remote interception in any meaningful sense. For certain categories of sensitive communication, that physical isolation has genuine value that no amount of encryption can fully replicate, because encryption protects content, while physical isolation protects the fact of communication itself. If no electronic record is created, there is nothing to decrypt and nothing to surveil at the network level. That is a real security advantage, and it is not unreasonable for a government to value it. But this raises a direct problem with the original reasoning that was used to justify the public closure. The 1984 decision to shut down the civilian network was based on the claim that the technology had become obsolete, unnecessary, unable to compete with modern alternatives. If that claim was accurate, it should have applied to the government network as well. The security advantage that justified continued government use did not suddenly appear in 1984. Physical tubes had always had that property. They were always unhackable in the electronic sense because they operated entirely outside the electronic domain. If security through physical isolation was a compelling reason to maintain the network in 1984, it was an equally compelling reason in 1974 or 1964 or any other point in the network's history. The security argument does not explain why the public system was closed. It only explains why the government system was not. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult, because those two positions, the technology is obsolete and the technology provides irreplaceable security, cannot both be true simultaneously in any straightforward sense. If the technology genuinely provided irreplaceable security advantages that electronic communication could not match, then it was not obsolete in 1984. It was valuable. Declaring it obsolete to the public while retaining it for government use because of its value is a different kind of decision than simply retiring an outdated system. It is a decision to remove a technology from public access while preserving its benefits for a specific class of users. Whether that decision was made consciously or whether it simply resulted from institutional inertia and separate decision-making processes for public and government infrastructure is not clearly established in the available documentation. Some believe the 20-year gap between the public closure and the government closure is simply a reflection of how differently public and government infrastructure are managed. The public postal network was subject to commercial considerations, to declining usage statistics, to cost-benefit analyses that weighed operational expenses against revenue and public utility. The government network operated under entirely different administrative logic. It was maintained as part of a broader set of continuity of government measures that are evaluated on security grounds rather than commercial ones. In that reading, the two closures at different times reflect two different decision-making frameworks applied to two different systems that happen to share the same underlying technology. The gap is bureaucratic and administrative, not deliberate or strategic. Others disagree with that interpretation. They point out that the public explanation for the 1984 closure was presented as a general statement about the technology itself, not as a statement about the economics of the public postal service specifically. The obsolescence framing applied to the technology. If the technology was what was obsolete, the government network would have been closed at the same time. The fact that it was not suggests either that the technology was not truly obsolete, or that the obsolescence framing was a convenient justification for a closure decision that was actually made on other grounds. Neither of those alternatives is comfortable within the official account. However, the timeline does not fully match the clean narrative of technological replacement when the complete sequence is examined. A technology is built in the 1860s. It serves the public for over a century. It is declared obsolete in 1984 and removed from public access. The government continues using it for 20 more years on the grounds that it is uniquely secure. And then, even after the government formally closes its own network in 2004, the story does not end, because according to information from sources familiar with the current infrastructure, pneumatic tubes still connect the Élysée Palace, the official residence of the French president, to the Hotel Matignon, the official residence of the Prime Minister. In 2026, physical tubes remain in service for communication between the two highest offices in the French government. That final detail is the one that most directly challenges the obsolescence explanation in its entirety. Not the 20-year gap between public and government closure. Not the security argument offered for continuing government use after 1984. But the fact that in the present day, the basic technology that was declared obsolete over 4 decades ago is still considered the appropriate communication method for the President and Prime Minister of France. No other communication technology from the 1860s occupies that position. Early telegraph systems are not maintained as backup channels between senior officials. Early telephone infrastructure has been replaced multiple times over. The pneumatic tube is unique in persisting at this level of governmental application while being understood publicly as a historical curiosity. The question that the official explanation does not answer clearly is what that persistence actually means. Some believe it is simply an old contingency measure that has never been formally removed because the cost and effort of removing it exceeds any practical reason to do so. The tubes are there. They work. Removing them requires physical excavation and infrastructure work. No one has made it a priority. Others disagree and argue that if the system were truly vestigial, it would have been decommissioned as part of the broader modernization of government infrastructure that has occurred over recent decades. Its continued existence, in this reading, reflects a continued assessment that it provides something that current electronic systems do not. Something in the official explanation does not add up. The technology cannot be simultaneously obsolete and irreplaceably secure. The public closure cannot be fully explained by obsolescence if the government simultaneously valued the technology enough to maintain it for 2 more decades. And the current existence of tubes connecting the president and prime minister cannot be explained as institutional inertia if those connections are maintained as active security infrastructure. Each piece of the official account, taken alone, has some internal logic. Taken together, across the full timeline from 1984 to the present, they describe something more complicated than the simple story of a technology being retired when better options arrived. What that more complicated story actually is remains, in the available public record, an open question. There is a pattern in the history of this network that becomes visible only when the full timeline is examined as a single sequence rather than as a series of separate events. Taken individually, each decision about the pneumatic system can be explained in isolation. The government used it first because it was still being tested. The public got access later because the system needed to be proven reliable. The public closure in 1984 happened because the technology had become expensive and less necessary. The government continued using it after 1984 because of institutional inertia or specific security requirements. Each step has an available explanation, but when those explanations are placed next to each other and the full sequence is read from beginning to end, something becomes harder to dismiss. The pattern that emerges is consistent in a way that individual explanations do not fully account for. The pattern is this. The network was built for government use first. It was open to public use second. When a decision was made to close it, the public version was shut down while the government version continued. And even after the government formally acknowledged closing its dedicated network in 2004, the infrastructure connecting the highest offices of the French state remained in place and operational. At every stage where a choice was made about who would retain access to this technology and who would not, the outcome was the same. The public lost access. The government kept it. That outcome repeated across different decades, different administrations, and different stated justifications. The consistency of that outcome is what makes the pattern worth examining carefully. To understand what that pattern currently looks like in practical terms, it helps to be specific about what is known regarding the present state of the infrastructure. According to sources familiar with the current arrangements beneath Paris, pneumatic tubes still connect 2 specific buildings. The Élysée Palace, which is the official residence and primary workplace of the President of the French Republic, and the Hotel Matignon, which is the official residence and primary workplace of the Prime Minister. These are the 2 most senior executive positions in the French government, and in 2026, those 2 offices are still connected by physical tubes running beneath the streets of the city, not as a museum exhibit, not as a preserved historical feature, as functional infrastructure. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely, because the Élysée Palace and the Hotel Matignon are not obscure administrative buildings. They are the operational centers of French executive power. They have access to every category of modern communication technology: secure telephone lines, encrypted digital networks, dedicated satellite communication channels, emergency radio systems, the full range of communication infrastructure that modern governments maintain for their most sensitive operations is available to both buildings. And alongside all of that modern infrastructure, physical pneumatic tubes still run beneath the street, connecting them. That combination, the most advanced available communication technology existing alongside a system from the 1860s, is unusual enough to warrant examination. The stated reason for maintaining the tube connection is emergency communication. The official explanation, offered by sources familiar with the system, is that the physical tubes provide a backup channel that cannot be disrupted by cyberattack or electronic interference. In a scenario where digital communication infrastructure is compromised, whether through hostile action, technical failure, or a broader systems collapse, the President and Prime Minister would still have a method of communicating with each other that operates entirely outside the electronic domain. A physical message in a physical container moving through a physical tube is not affected by anything that happens in the digital world. It cannot be hacked. It cannot be jammed. It cannot be intercepted remotely. It simply moves through the underground at the same speed it always has, independent of whatever is happening in the electronic environment above and around it. At first, it seems normal to accept emergency backup reasoning for unusual infrastructure choices. Governments do maintain redundant systems for exactly these kinds of scenarios. The existence of backup communication channels that operate on different principles from primary systems is a standard feature of continuity of government planning. If the primary digital networks fail, an alternative is available. That logic applies to emergency power generators, to backup water supplies, to redundant transportation routes. Having a physical communication channel as a backup to digital systems follows the same principle. Reasonable preparedness. Nothing more. But there's a problem when that reasoning is applied to the specific technology being maintained as the backup. The pneumatic tube connecting the Élysée and Matignon is not just any backup system. It is a backup system using technology that the French government publicly declared obsolete in 1984. More than 4 decades ago, the official position was that this technology could not compete with modern alternatives. That position was used to justify removing the technology from public access. And yet, for the most sensitive communication requirement in the entire country, the communication channel between the President and Prime Minister during a national emergency, the chosen backup is that same declared obsolete technology. That sequence does not resolve cleanly. If the technology was truly obsolete in 1984, it should not be the preferred emergency backup in 2026. If it is the preferred emergency backup in 2026, it was not truly obsolete in 1984. Some believe this apparent contradiction is less significant than it appears. The obsolescence argument of 1984, in this reading, was specifically about the economics and practicality of running a public postal service on pneumatic tubes. It was not a statement about the technology's absolute capabilities. A technology can be obsolete as a mass public service while remaining valuable for specific limited applications. A horse is obsolete as primary urban transportation, but remains valuable in specific contexts. The pneumatic tube is obsolete as a public message system, but remains valuable as a secure physical backup channel for a very small number of critical communications. The two assessments are not contradictory because they apply to different scales and different purposes. Others disagree with that reading. They point out that the 1984 public closure was not framed as an economic decision about the viability of a mass postal service. It was framed as a technological assessment. The technology had been superseded. Better options existed. That was the public explanation. If the real reason for the closure was economic rather than technological, that framing was misleading. And if the framing was misleading, the question of why the public was given a technological explanation for what was actually an economic decision becomes worth asking. Misleading framings for infrastructure decisions are not impossible, but they are worth noting when they appear in the historical record. However, the timeline does not fully match the clean narrative of the backup system explanation when the broader pattern is considered. If the tubes connecting the Élysée and Matignon are maintained purely as emergency backup infrastructure, that classification applies to a very specific and limited purpose. It does not explain the 20-year continued operation of the Senate and National Assembly network after the public closure. Those connections were not emergency backup channels for the President and Prime Minister. They were operational communication lines between legislative institutions and the official government record. Their continued operation from 1984 to 2004 served a different function than emergency backup communication for executive leadership. The backup explanation accounts for the current Élysée-Matignon connection. It does not account for the full scope of what the government continued operating after the public system closed. This is where it becomes unclear, because the pattern across the full timeline involves more than a single emergency backup channel being maintained out of reasonable caution. It involves the complete government network continuing operation for 2 decades, followed by the retention of at least one active connection that remains operational today. At each stage, the continued government use was justified by some form of the security argument, but the security argument shifts slightly depending on which period is being examined. In the immediate post-1984 period, the justification appears to have centered on operational security for the legislative communication function. In the current period, the justification centers on emergency backup for executive communication. The security argument is consistent in type, but different in specific application across different time periods. That flexibility in justification is itself worth noting, and this is where the explanation becomes difficult. A justification that can be adapted to fit different circumstances across different decades, without ever fully resolving the underlying question of why the technology was declared obsolete for the public, while being retained for government, is doing a specific kind of work. It is providing cover for a decision pattern without fully explaining it. The available explanations account for parts of what happened. They do not account for the whole sequence in a way that is internally consistent from beginning to end. And the parts they do not account for are precisely the parts that reveal the most about what this network was actually for and who it was actually maintained to serve. The comparison with other technologies from the same era makes the pattern more visible. The telegraph was the dominant communication technology of the same period in which the pneumatic network was built. Telegraph infrastructure is entirely gone from active government use. No emergency backup telegraph lines connect senior French officials. Early telephone technology, the rotary dial exchanges and analog switching systems that once formed the backbone of government communication, has been completely replaced multiple times over. Early radio communication systems from the early 20th century are not maintained as active backup channels. None of the other communication technologies from the same historical period as the pneumatic tube has survived into active operational use at any level of government. The pneumatic tube is unique in this regard, and that uniqueness is not explained by the emergency backup argument alone, because the same emergency backup argument could theoretically apply to telegraph or early telephone systems if physical isolation from electronic networks was the only criterion. Some believe the pneumatic tube survived where other historical technologies did not, simply because of the specific physical properties of the infrastructure. The tubes are already there. They run through existing underground channels. Maintaining them in operational condition is less disruptive than the alternatives because the infrastructure is self-contained and does not require significant above-ground footprint. Other historical technologies required surface infrastructure, antenna systems, or external facilities that were more visible and more complicated to maintain quietly. The tube exists underground, where it always existed, where it has always been maintained by the same institutional structures that maintained it during its public operation. Its survival is a function of its location as much as its utility. Others disagree and point out that passive infrastructure survival does not explain active operational maintenance. A tube that is simply left in place and not maintained will stop functioning within a relatively short period. Seals degrade. Compressors require servicing. The system requires active upkeep to remain operational. The fact that it is operational today means that someone is actively maintaining it. Active maintenance requires budget allocation, personnel assignment, and institutional decision-making. Those decisions are being made continuously, in the present, by people who have assessed the value of the system against its cost and concluded that it is worth keeping functional. That is not passive survival. That is active choice. And the pattern of who those choices consistently favor, across more than a century of the network's history, is what raises the questions that the official timeline does not clearly answer. Built for power, kept by power, removed from public access at the moment when maintaining it for everyone became less convenient than maintaining it for a few. That description of the pattern does not require any specific claim about intent or conspiracy. It simply describes what the documented sequence of decisions produced as an outcome, whether that outcome was the result of deliberate strategy or the accumulation of individually reasonable decisions that happened to consistently favor the same interests is a question the available record leaves open. What the record does establish is the pattern itself, and the pattern, read across the full timeline from 1866 to the present day, is consistent in a way that the official explanations, taken individually, do not fully address. The story of the Paris pneumatic network does not exist in isolation. That is one of the details that becomes clear when the broader history of this technology is examined across different countries and different cities. Paris was not the first city to build something like this. It was not the only city to build something like this. And it was not the only city where the pattern of public construction, followed by public closure, followed by questions about what remained afterward, played out in ways that were not fully explained. The pneumatic tube network was an international phenomenon, and the pattern of how those networks were built, used, and eventually removed from public knowledge repeated itself across multiple countries, with enough consistency to suggest that the Paris story is not an isolated case, but part of something larger. London built the first pneumatic dispatch system in 1853. More than a decade before Paris began its experimental line. The London system connected the stock exchange to the electric telegraph company, a distance that could be covered in a fraction of the time required by surface delivery. The choice of endpoints is worth noting. Not a hospital and a post office, not a residential neighborhood and a government ministry, a financial exchange and a telegraph company. The first pneumatic communication link in London served the intersection of financial and information infrastructure. That combination, financial markets and rapid private communication, raises questions about who the primary intended beneficiaries of early pneumatic technology actually were, in London as in Paris. Berlin constructed its own network, known as the Rohrpost, which translates roughly as tube post. The Berlin system grew to become one of the largest pneumatic networks ever built, reaching approximately 400 kilometers at its operational peak in 1940. That peak year is itself worth pausing on. 1940 was not a period of ordinary urban administration in Berlin. It was the middle of the Second World War, during which Germany was simultaneously conducting military operations across multiple fronts and managing an increasingly controlled domestic information environment. The fact that the pneumatic network reached its maximum extent during that specific period raises questions that the standard account of urban communication infrastructure does not directly address. The Berlin Rohrpost was finally shut down in 1976, more than 3 decades after the war ended. What it carried during those intervening decades, and under what administrative arrangements, is not a question the easily available historical record answers in any detail. Prague built its own pneumatic network, beginning in 1889. The system covered approximately 60 kilometers beneath the city. Prague's network operated through a period that included 2 world wars, the occupation of the city by Nazi Germany, the post-war establishment of a communist government, and the political changes of the late 20th century. Each of those periods involved significant changes in who controlled the city, who controlled its communication infrastructure, and what kinds of messages were considered sensitive. A physical underground communication network that could move messages without electronic trace would have had different significance under each of those different political arrangements. The Prague network's history across that turbulent political sequence is documented at the level of its existence and technical specifications. The question of how it was used and by whom during specific periods of political transition is considerably less clear. But this is where it becomes unclear, because the pattern across London, Berlin, and Prague follows a similar arc to the one visible in Paris. Networks were built. They operated for extended periods. They were eventually declared obsolete and closed to the public. The physical infrastructure was partially or fully removed, and the detailed history of what traveled through those systems during their operational periods, particularly during politically sensitive moments, is not fully accessible in the records that are easily available today. That consistent gap between infrastructure history and communication content history appears in each case. Whether that gap is simply the result of how administrative records are kept and what is considered worth preserving, or whether it reflects something more deliberate about how these systems were documented, is a question that cannot be answered from the surface-level historical record. In the United States, the story takes a specific form in New York City. In 1897, the city launched an official pneumatic mail system. The infrastructure covered 27 miles beneath Manhattan and connected 23 post offices across the borough. At its operational peak, the system handled approximately 95,000 letters per day. That figure represents roughly 30% of all mail moving through the city at the time. Nearly a third of New York's mail was traveling underground through pressurized tubes rather than through surface delivery. That is not a marginal or experimental operation. That is a system carrying a substantial portion of a major city's communication load. People depended on it. Institutions were organized around it. It was woven into the operational fabric of how the city functioned. Then, on December 31st, 1953, the service was suspended. The explanation offered was the familiar one. The technology had become obsolete. The system was too expensive to maintain. Modern alternatives had made it unnecessary. The closure was presented as the logical conclusion of a technological cycle that had run its course. And unlike the Paris system, which left behind documented traces in archives and the memory of people who had used it, the New York pneumatic network left almost nothing physical behind. The infrastructure was torn out, construction projects built over what had been there. Within a few decades, the physical evidence of a system that had once carried nearly a third of the city's mail was almost entirely gone. A few fittings in the basement of an old post office building. Some mentions in administrative records. Almost nothing else. At first, it seems normal to accept that decommissioned infrastructure gets removed and replaced. Cities are constantly rebuilding. Underground space is valuable and gets repurposed. An old postal system gets torn out to make room for newer utilities. That is a reasonable description of how urban infrastructure evolves. But there's a problem when you consider the scale of what was removed. 27 miles of underground infrastructure, connecting 23 facilities, handling nearly a third of a major city's mail at its peak, was dismantled so completely that today almost no physical evidence of it remains. The thoroughness of that removal is itself unusual. Large infrastructure projects typically leave more traces. Foundations remain. Sealed sections persist. Something physical endures even when a system is taken out of service. The near-total disappearance of the New York pneumatic network from the physical record stands in contrast to how other decommissioned urban infrastructure is typically handled. Old subway stations that were closed decades ago still exist as sealed chambers beneath the city, occasionally reopened for inspection or events. Abandoned rail tunnels remain intact for years or decades after their last operational use. The physical fabric of underground infrastructure tends to persist even when the systems it served no longer operate. The pneumatic mail network is an exception to that pattern, and exceptions to patterns that apply broadly are worth examining for what makes them different. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely, because the question of why one category of decommissioned infrastructure was removed so thoroughly, while other categories were left in place, does not have an obvious answer in the standard account. The cost of removal is significant. Tearing out 27 miles of underground tubing, removing compressor equipment, sealing connection points, and then building over the resulting spaces requires substantial resources. Doing nothing and simply leaving the infrastructure in place as a sealed but intact system would have been cheaper in the short term. The decision to remove it thoroughly rather than simply decommission it in place reflects a choice about what should remain accessible and what should not. That choice was made. The reasoning behind it is not clearly documented in what is easily available. However, the timeline does not fully match the clean narrative of technological obsolescence when the beach pneumatic subway is placed alongside the official postal system in the historical sequence. Because 27 years before New York's official pneumatic mail system began operating, an inventor had already built something far more ambitious beneath the same city. Alfred Ely Beach was not a marginal figure. He was the editor of Scientific American, a patent attorney, and an inventor with substantial technical credibility. In 1870, working with permissions granted for a small package delivery tube, He constructed something entirely different. A full passenger subway. A cylindrical tunnel 9 feet in diameter, over 300 feet long, equipped with a passenger car propelled by a large fan generating air pressure. The station he built was not a utilitarian transit facility. It had a grand piano, chandeliers, paintings on the walls, and a fountain stocked with goldfish. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult, because Beach did not have permission to build a passenger subway. He had permission for small mail tubes. What he actually constructed was something categorically different from what his permits authorized. He built it at night, removing excavated material under cover of darkness, working directly beneath some of the most prominent streets in Manhattan. The station he created was not hidden in a remote location. It was built directly across from City Hall, and no one in the city's administrative or political infrastructure knew it was happening until Beach chose to reveal it publicly in February of 1870. Some believe the Beach subway story is simply an example of a determined inventor finding creative ways around bureaucratic obstacles. The city was controlled by political interests that were opposed to underground transit because it would threaten profits from the elevated rail systems they planned to build. Beach found a way around that opposition by building first and revealing later. His methods were irregular, but his goal was straightforward. He wanted to demonstrate that underground transit worked, and he succeeded. The subway functioned. 400,000 people paid to see it and ride it in the first year. The story in this reading is about individual ingenuity overcoming institutional resistance. Others point toward a different dimension of the Beach story. The question it raises is not only about one inventor's determination. It is about what the episode reveals regarding the practical possibility of building significant underground infrastructure without the knowledge of surface-level authorities. Beach built a full passenger subway, complete with elaborate interior features, beneath one of the most administratively surveilled pieces of urban real estate in the country, and no one knew it was happening. Not because the work was invisible. Workers were present. Equipment was moved. Excavated material had to go somewhere. The construction happened and went undetected because attention was not directed toward it. That is a practical demonstration of something important about the relationship between underground space and institutional awareness. In 1912, 42 years after Beach sealed his tunnel, construction workers excavating for a new subway line broke through a bricked-up wall and found themselves standing in a space that had been completely unknown to them. The passenger car was still on the tracks. The space was structurally intact. 42 years had passed. A full generation of New Yorkers had been born, lived, and died without any awareness that a passenger subway existed beneath their city. It had not been destroyed. It had not been officially documented in a way that carried forward into institutional memory. It had simply been sealed and forgotten, and then it was found by accident. That sequence produces a question that is genuinely difficult to answer. If a passenger subway, built in one of the most documented and administratively dense cities in the world, could be sealed and forgotten for 42 years before being discovered by accident, what else exists beneath these cities that no one is currently looking for? Not a speculation. As a practical question about the limits of institutional memory and the relationship between underground infrastructure and the awareness of it that exists at the surface level. The Beach subway was not lost because the records were destroyed. It was lost because the records that existed were not connected to the awareness of the people who came after. That disconnection between what is documented and what is known is exactly the same disconnection that appears in the history of the pneumatic postal networks. And it raises the same question in both cases. What remains that we are not currently looking for, and why are we not looking for it? At this point in the investigation, it is worth stepping back from the individual details and considering what the complete picture actually shows. The history of the pneumatic network has been examined across multiple dimensions. Its origins in government use before public access was granted. The parallel private infrastructure that ran alongside the civilian system from the beginning. The political context in which riot-proof features were built into government communication lines. The appearance of the network at the center of a national espionage scandal. The 20-year gap between public closure and government closure. The continued existence of active tube connections between the highest offices in the French state. The international pattern of similar networks being built, used, and then removed from public knowledge in comparable ways. And the demonstration, through the beach subway story, that significant underground infrastructure can disappear from collective awareness entirely within a single generation. All of that is now on the table. The question is what to make of it. There are different ways to interpret this accumulated evidence. That is worth stating clearly at the outset, because the evidence itself does not point unambiguously toward a single conclusion. It raises questions. It identifies gaps. It reveals inconsistencies between official explanations and documented timelines. But it does not, on its own, resolve into one definitive account of what happened and why. Responsible examination of this kind of evidence requires holding multiple interpretations simultaneously and being honest about what each one explains well and what each one fails to account for. That is what this investigation attempts to do. Not to confirm a predetermined conclusion, but to examine what the evidence actually supports. The first interpretation is the straightforward one. Governments built communication infrastructure to solve real problems. The pneumatic network solved a genuine communication bottleneck in 19th century Paris. It worked, so it expanded. It was useful, so it was maintained. It became expensive and less necessary as electronic alternatives arrived, so the public version was eventually closed. The government kept its own version longer because government institutions move slowly, because bureaucratic inertia is a real force in large administrative systems, and because redundant communication channels have genuine value during emergencies regardless of whether they are the most technologically advanced option available. The tubes connecting the president and prime minister today are simply an old contingency measure that has never been formally removed because no one has made its removal a priority. The cost and effort of decommissioning it exceeds the institutional motivation to do so. This reading is clean. It requires no unusual assumptions about deliberate strategy or coordinated decision-making across different administrations and different decades. It explains the evidence through ordinary mechanisms: bureaucratic inertia, institutional conservatism, reasonable emergency preparedness, cost-benefit calculations that favored keeping an existing system over the effort of removing it. These are not exotic explanations. They are the kinds of factors that influence infrastructure decisions in large governments all the time, and they are genuinely sufficient to account for at least some of what the historical record shows. At first, it seems normal to accept this reading as complete. It fits the pattern of how governments typically manage aging infrastructure. It does not require any assumptions about coordinated intent. It does not require any claims about deliberate concealment. And it has the significant advantage of being the simpler explanation. When two interpretations account for the available evidence, the simpler one deserves preference unless the more complex one accounts for something that the simpler one cannot. The question, then, is whether the simpler reading actually does account for everything the evidence shows. And this is where it becomes unclear, because the straightforward interpretation handles some parts of the evidence well and handles other parts poorly. It accounts for bureaucratic inertia after the public closure. It accounts for reasonable emergency preparedness as a justification for maintaining backup channels. It accounts for the general pattern of government infrastructure outlasting public infrastructure when the government has specific reasons to value what it is maintaining. But it does not account cleanly for the original design of the network, in which government use preceded public use by 11 years, and a parallel private layer was built simultaneously with the public opening. Bureaucratic inertia does not explain original design decisions. The riot-proof features built into the government network from the beginning were not the result of inertia. They were deliberate design choices made before the system had any history of operation. The straightforward interpretation struggles to account for choices that were made at the beginning, before there was anything to be inert about. But there is a second interpretation that some researchers and historians have pointed toward when examining this history. This reading does not begin with the assumption that the public network was the primary project and the government layer was a secondary addition. It begins with the reverse assumption. What if the network was built primarily as government communication infrastructure, and public access was added as a secondary function, perhaps to defray construction and operational costs, perhaps to provide a civilian cover story for the real purpose, or perhaps simply because extending access to the public seemed like a reasonable use of existing infrastructure that was already being maintained. In this reading, the public network was never the main point. It was a use case layered on top of something that served a different primary purpose. This interpretation reframes the 1984 closure differently. Rather than a technology becoming obsolete for everyone, with the government simply being slower to let go of it, the closure represents the moment when maintaining the public layer of the network was no longer worth the cost of doing so. The civilian system was removed from public access, not because the technology was obsolete, but because the public function had become an operational burden that no longer justified its cost. The government kept its own layer because that layer was always the point. The public system was the accessory. When the accessory became expensive, it was removed. The core remained because the core always had a different set of reasons for existing. Some believe this second interpretation gives too much credit to deliberate long-term planning. Governments do not typically operate with that level of strategic coherence across multiple administrations spanning more than a century. The decisions about the pneumatic network were made by many different people over many different decades, responding to many different circumstances. Attributing a single unified strategic logic to that sequence of decisions assumes a continuity of purpose that rarely exists in actual government administration. Individual decisions that each made sense in their own context can produce a pattern that looks coherent in retrospect without having been planned as a coherent whole. The appearance of strategy can emerge from accumulated individual choices without any single actor having had the complete picture in mind. Others disagree with that dismissal. They point out that some institutional purposes persist across administrations, not because of coordinated planning, but because certain functions become embedded in the infrastructure of the state itself. The tubes connecting the Élysée and Matignon are not maintained because a specific person decided they should be. They are maintained because their maintenance is part of the institutional routine of the offices they connect. That routine persists across changes in personnel, changes in government, and changes in political orientation because it is part of how those institutions function rather than a decision that any specific administration actively chose to continue. The persistence of function does not require a conspiracy. It requires only that the function becomes part of the institutional baseline. However, the timeline does not fully match either interpretation and isolation. The straightforward reading accounts for persistence, but not for original design. The exclusivity reading accounts for original design, but requires assumptions about institutional intent that are difficult to verify from the available record. What both interpretations share is a recognition that the official explanation, the simple story of a technology being built for public benefit and then retired when better options arrived, does not account for the complete sequence of what happened. Both readings agree that the official story is incomplete. They disagree about what the complete story actually is. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult, because the gap between what is documented and what is explained is not a small one. It is not a matter of a few minor details that do not quite fit the official account. It is a gap that runs through the entire history of the network from its original design through its current operational state. The network was designed in a specific way that the public explanation does not fully account for. It was operated in a specific way that the public explanation does not fully describe. It was closed for the public in a way that produced outcomes the public explanation frames as incidental, but which look, across the full timeline, more like the natural result of built-in design priorities. And it continues to exist in a form that the public explanation frames as a minor historical footnote, but which represents, in practical terms, active infrastructure serving the highest levels of government in 2026. The physical properties of the tube system are worth examining in this context because they are central to both interpretations. A pneumatic message tube has characteristics that no electronic communication system shares. It cannot be accessed remotely. There is no signal to intercept, no transmission to monitor, no data stream to analyze. A message traveling through a physical tube beneath the streets of Paris exists only as a physical object, moving through a physical space. To intercept it, someone must be physically present in the specific section of underground infrastructure through which it is traveling. That requires knowledge of the system's routing, physical access to the underground channels, and timing precise enough to intercept a container moving at speed through a sealed tube. Remote surveillance, the kind that has become ubiquitous in the electronic communication environment, simply does not apply. That detail sounds minor at first, until it is examined more closely in the context of when the public system was closed. The 1984 closure occurred at a specific moment in the history of electronic surveillance. By the early 1980s, the technical infrastructure for monitoring electronic communications at scale was becoming increasingly sophisticated. Intelligence agencies in multiple countries were developing and expanding capabilities for intercepting telecommunications. The period immediately surrounding the public closure of the pneumatic network was precisely the period when the electronic communication environment was becoming significantly more surveilled. Whether that timing is coincidental or meaningful is not established by the available evidence, but it is a detail that neither the straightforward interpretation nor the exclusivity interpretation fully addresses. Some believe the surveillance context is irrelevant to the closure decision. The pneumatic network was closed because it was old, expensive, and less useful than fax and telex. The surveillance environment of the early 1980s had nothing to do with a postal service closure. The decision was administrative and economic. Reading intelligence considerations into a routine infrastructure decommissioning applies a level of significance that the decision simply did not carry. Others disagree and note that the stated justification for maintaining the government network after the public closure was explicitly about the security properties that made the tubes resistant to interception. If the security properties were relevant to the decision to keep the government system running, they were potentially relevant to the decision about the public system as well. The same properties that made the tubes valuable to keep for government use were properties that the public would have lost access to when the civilian system closed. That gap between what is documented and what is explained is where the real question in this investigation lives, not in the dramatic possibilities that speculation might suggest. In the specific, verifiable distance between what the official account says happened and what the documented record shows actually occurred. That distance is real. It is measurable. It appears at multiple points in the timeline across more than a century of the network's history, and it does not resolve cleanly into either the straightforward interpretation or the exclusivity interpretation. It sits between them, unaccounted for by either, pointing toward something that the available record suggests, but does not fully state. What that something is remains, at this stage of the investigation, genuinely open, and open questions, when they are based on documented evidence rather than speculation, deserve to remain open until the evidence actually resolves them. This one has not been resolved yet. This is where the investigation currently stands. Not at a conclusion, not at a resolved explanation that ties every detail together into a clean and satisfying account, but at a documented position, a specific place in the evidence, where what is known and what remains unexplained can be stated clearly and honestly. That is worth doing carefully, because the history of the pneumatic network is not a story where the gaps are small or peripheral. The gaps are central. They appear at the most important points in the timeline, and they have remained open not because no one has looked, but because the available documentation does not close them. What follows is an attempt to state precisely what is established, what is missing, and what that combination of established fact and missing explanation actually means for anyone trying to understand what this network was and what it continues to be. A communication network of genuinely enormous scale operated beneath the streets of Paris for more than a century. That is not an approximation or an estimate based on incomplete records. It is documented infrastructure with documented operational statistics. At its peak, the network stretched across 427 kilometers of underground tubes, connecting 130 offices across the city. In a single year, 1945, the system handled 30 million messages. That figure appears in the administrative records of the French Postal Service. 30 million physical messages moving through underground tubes in one calendar year. 82,000 messages per day on average. That is the scale of what existed. And that scale makes the subsequent disappearance of this network from public awareness, not from the archives, but from the casual knowledge of the people who live above it. One of the more unusual features of its history, the network was not peripheral to daily life in Paris during its operational period. It was embedded in the city's communication fabric at every level. Personal correspondence traveled through it. Commercial transactions depended on it. Journalistic copy moved through it. Government institutions used it for internal communication. And it appeared at a critical moment, at the center of one of the most consequential legal and political scandals in French history, when a torn pneumatic message became the key piece of evidence in the Dreyfus affair. A system that touches that many dimensions of a city's life, that appears in court records and espionage investigations and daily commercial routine simultaneously, is not a minor historical footnote. It is central infrastructure. And central infrastructure, when it disappears from collective memory within a generation of its closure, raises questions about how that disappearance happened. But this is where it becomes unclear, because the disappearance from public memory did not happen because the records were destroyed. The maps of the network exist. The operational statistics were recorded. The administrative histories were written. The technical specifications were documented. The archives that contain the history of the pneumatic postal system are accessible to researchers. The information did not vanish. The awareness of it did. And those two things are different in a way that matters. When records disappear, the loss is visible. Someone looking for information finds nothing and knows that a gap exists. When awareness disappears while records remain intact, the loss is invisible. No one looks for the information because no one knows to look. That is a more complete kind of disappearance. And it raises a question that neither the straightforward interpretation nor the exclusivity interpretation fully answers. How does awareness of infrastructure that scale disappear from a city's understanding of itself within living memory of its closure? Then it was declared obsolete. The public network was closed in 1984 with an explanation that centered on technological supersession and economic impracticality. That explanation was accepted without significant public challenge at the time. The fax machine and telex had arrived. Electronic communication was advancing rapidly. A tube system from the 1860s seemed like an obvious candidate for retirement. The closure was presented as the natural end of a long technological cycle, and most people who heard about it found that framing reasonable enough not to examine further. The system closed. Life continued with new communication methods. The network faded from daily experience and then from daily awareness, but the government continued using it for 20 more years. That fact is documented. The dedicated lines connecting the Senate, the National Assembly, and the Journal Officiel remained operational until 2004, not as museum pieces, not as sealed but inactive infrastructure, as functioning communication channels carrying actual messages between actual institutions. For 2 decades after the public was told the technology was obsolete, those tubes were in active use. The maintenance was ongoing. The operational routines continued. And the justification offered, when the question was raised, was security. The physical tubes provided something that electronic systems could not: an unhackable channel, a communication method that left no electronic trace and could not be remotely intercepted. That justification is coherent on its own terms, but it creates a problem that has been noted throughout this investigation. A technology that provides irreplaceable security is not obsolete. Those two descriptions cannot be simultaneously accurate, and some portion of it is still active today. That is not a historical claim. It is a present-tense statement about infrastructure that is currently operational. The tubes connecting the Élysée Palace to the Hotel Matignon, connecting the official residences of the French President and Prime Minister, are functioning in 2026. Physical messages can travel between those two offices through underground tubes that operate on the same basic principle as the system Napoleon III ordered constructed in 1866. Every other communication technology from that era has been fully replaced. Multiple times over, in most cases. The telegraph is gone. Early telephone infrastructure has been replaced and replaced again. Early radio systems have been superseded by multiple generations of newer technology. The pneumatic tube is unique among 19th century communication technologies in remaining active at the highest level of a major government in the present day. That uniqueness is not explained by any of the official accounts in a way that is fully satisfying. At first, it seems normal to treat each of these facts in isolation. The public closure was an economic decision. The government continuation was an institutional inertia. The current active connection is a minor legacy feature that no one has gotten around to removing. Each individual fact has an available individual explanation, but there's a problem when those individual explanations are assembled into a complete account. They do not fit together cleanly. The economic argument for the public closure is undermined by the security argument for the government continuation. The institutional inertia argument for the post-1984 continuation is undermined by the active maintenance that operational infrastructure requires. The minor legacy feature argument for the current connection is undermined by the fact that it connects the two most senior offices in the country and is described by sources familiar with it as active security infrastructure rather than dormant historical remnant. The explanations for each individual piece do not add up to a coherent explanation for the whole. The same pattern appeared in other cities. That is the international dimension of this investigation that adds weight to what might otherwise seem like a Paris-specific anomaly. London built a pneumatic system that connected financial and telegraph infrastructure. Berlin's Rohrpost reached its maximum extent during wartime and operated for decades afterward under administrative arrangements that are not fully documented. Prague's network persisted through multiple political systems, each of which had different relationships to underground communication infrastructure. New York's system was removed with a thoroughness that stands out against how other decommissioned urban infrastructure is typically handled. In each case, the public system was shut down while questions about what continued or what remained were not fully answered by the official accounts. The pattern is not identical in every city, but it is similar enough across multiple independent cases to suggest that something about how these networks were understood by those who built and operated them differed from how they were presented to the public they nominally served. However, the timeline does not fully match the clean narrative of technological replacement when the complete international picture is considered. If pneumatic networks became obsolete because electronic communication superseded them, that supersession occurred globally and simultaneously. Electronic communication did not replace pneumatic tubes only in Paris. It replaced them everywhere. And yet the closures in different cities happened at different times, under different stated justifications, with different levels of documentation of what remained afterward. The obsolescence argument should produce relatively consistent closure timelines across different cities if it was the actual driving factor. The actual closure timelines were not consistent. They varied considerably, and the variations do not follow an obvious pattern related to the pace of electronic communication adoption in each city. There is no clear explanation for why physical tube communication remains in use between France's two highest offices when every other technology from that era has been fully replaced. That absence of clear explanation is worth stating precisely. This is not a case where an explanation exists but is contested. It is a case where the available official accounts do not directly address the question. The emergency backup justification has been offered, and it has some logic, but it does not explain why this specific technology from this specific era occupies the backup role rather than more recent physical communication alternatives. It does not explain why the backup channel for the two most senior government officials uses infrastructure from the 1860s, when the entire security infrastructure surrounding those officials has been updated continuously across the intervening decades. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult in a specific way, because the absence of clear explanation is itself a piece of information. When a documented fact lacks a documented explanation, that gap tells you something about what was considered worth explaining publicly and what was not. The French government has not, in any accessible public record, provided a detailed account of why tubes from the 19th century remained the chosen backup communication channel between the president and prime minister. That account may exist in internal documents that are not publicly accessible. It may exist in classified assessments of communication security that inform decisions without being publicly explained. Or it may simply have never been written down in any formal way because the decision to maintain the connection was never a formal decision, just an ongoing institutional practice that no one has formally examined or challenged. There's no clear record of exactly what was communicated through those tubes during the years when digital surveillance was becoming possible and physical messages were not. That gap in the record is significant. The period from roughly 1975 to 2004 was one in which electronic communication surveillance expanded dramatically in capability and scope. Intelligence agencies developed increasingly sophisticated tools for monitoring electronic communication at scale. Encryption became a serious subject of government policy. The vulnerability of digital communication to interception became a documented concern rather than a theoretical one. And during precisely that period, the French government was maintaining a physical communication network that existed entirely outside the electronic surveillance environment. What traveled through those tubes during those years is not documented in any accessible public record. The volume of communication, the nature of the institutions connected, the period of heightened surveillance concern, all of those factors are documented. The content of what moved through the system during that period is not. These are not accusations. That point deserves emphasis at this stage of the investigation. Nothing in the documented record requires an accusation to explain. Everything described here could be accounted for by ordinary institutional behavior, reasonable security planning, bureaucratic inertia, and the kind of decisions that large governments make about infrastructure without any deliberate concealment or unusual intent. The gaps in the record are not proof of anything hidden. They are simply gaps. Documented places where the official account does not fully account for what the documented evidence shows. Gaps of that kind exist in many historical records, without implying anything more than the ordinary incompleteness of institutional documentation. But gaps in documented systems do deserve examination, not because their existence proves concealment, but because their location and nature tell you something about what was considered worth documenting publicly and what was not. The technical specifications of the pneumatic network were documented thoroughly. The operational statistics were recorded carefully. The closure decisions were announced and explained. The content of government communication through the private network was not documented in any publicly accessible way. That distribution of what was recorded and what was not is itself a pattern, and patterns in what gets documented and what is not are meaningful to anyone trying to understand what a system was actually for. The question that remains, the one this investigation cannot currently answer from the available evidence, is a straightforward one. What exactly was being kept private through those tubes? And why does some portion of the infrastructure that kept it private appear to still be running? That question is not rhetorical. It is a genuine request for information that the available record does not provide. The tubes exist. Their existence is documented. Their current operational status, at least in the connection between the Élysée and Matignon, is confirmed by sources familiar with the infrastructure. What moves through them? What has moved through them during the decades when the public system no longer existed but the government system continued, remains a documented gap in a documented system. And documented gaps, when they appear consistently at the points in a history where the most important questions live, are exactly the kind of thing that deserves continued attention rather than the same comfortable forgetting that allowed the network itself to disappear from public awareness within a generation of its closure.